We got back from the trip, and James and I butchered the pig and got it into vacuum bags and put it in the freezer. It's a couple weeks later now. We thawed out some of those bags, and we're going to turn them into sausage. So this is a bag of pork shoulder that James did a lovely labeling job on. We're going to cut it open and turn it into sausage. Usually when you vacuum seal meat like this, you end up with some liquid in the bag. So you can see down here there's a little bit of a drainage. So I like to just drain that off before we start working with it. Keeps the cutting board a little cleaner and more manageable. So there we go, and that's looking good. So we are ready to rock. So the stuff that we're happy about here is this relatively hard fat. So we're gonna keep that. That's good stuff. The stuff that we're not happy about is anything that's harder or more chewy, stuff that won't necessarily grind up very well or turn into pretty sausage. So when you're cutting this up, you're looking for cutting it into chunks that will fit into your meat grinder. For most meat grinders, that means you want, 1-inch cubes roughly, but depending on the quality, it can be a little larger or a little smaller. Make sure your meat, when you're working with it, is cold. You don't want it to ever get to room temperature because that's not safe. It's very important to have a sharp knife for this work. It's easy to, when working with sort of oddly shaped cuts like this, to accidentally cut yourself if you're not applying pressure with a sharp knife in a consistent way. So this here, you can sort of see it's a little dodgy. This is mostly a matter of personal preference whether you trim this sort of stuff off. A lot of guys just grind it. I think that's probably fine too. I err on the trimming off side. I think that when you're making sausage, you get out what you put into it, and a little more effort here up front will make for a more tender and, I think, delicious sausage. Luckily, the pig that I shot was a fairly young one, so the meat doesn't have a lot of crazy, chewy connective tissue in it. So we're actually not having to remove too much. Most of this is just going to go straight into the grinder. So wild animals have to work a lot harder than farm-raised animals do, so the connective tissue can be a lot more dense and tough, and that can lead to sausage that has a little too much chew in it for my taste. So I tend to try and take out as much as I can. This animal in particular was a relatively young one, and so it hadn't quite developed a lot of the tougher connective tissues that you'll see in older animals. Kitchen towel under the cutting board is a nice little trick I picked up at some point over the years, and helps your cutting board from sliding around, especially on a slick surface like this, or, well, most kitchen counters. So you can see this all looks pretty similar to pork you'd buy at the grocery store. The meat around the entrance and exit wounds, however, does not. It looks very bloody, and it is not an appealing look, but it also is not a delicious meat. So what you're going to want to do is be fairly aggressive when trimming off that bloodshot meat. It is not good eats. So this meat that I'm cutting up is from the pork shoulder. It's a very popular cut for making sausage around the world. Spain, Mexico, Italy, you name it, China. The qualities that make it good for sausage making is that it has a lot of intramuscular fat. So it retains its moisture because of all the fat that's integrated into the meat. So this is a good example of something that we don't want. This fat here, you can see it's really soft. It's not hard like the fat that we were cutting earlier. That is not good eats, and we're going to trim it off. It would probably be okay if it was on the end of a steak or something that you were cutting on, but in this case, for sausage making, we want hard fat and lots of it. Yeah, so contrast the little globuly soft stuff with this nice hard fat that's in between the muscles. That's good stuff. That'll grind up nicely. So once we're done trimming this up, we're going to put it on a sheet pan and put it in the freezer for about an hour to 2 hours. The idea there is we want this to be as cold as possible when we are grinding it. So if you grind at room temperature or even fridge temperature, the fat will pretty frequently smear, which means that the the grinder blade and the grinder disc will basically squeeze it, and it will slide out and sort of lose a lot of its fat into the sausage. You want it to be as cold and hard as possible so that it gets ground into discrete chunks that we can see in the sausage, and will have a good texture in the finished sausage. Another reason to not send your meat to a processor is that you get full control over how much of this is included in your sausage. Most processors, I think it's safe to say, most processors don't do much trimming of the meat before they throw it into the grinder. With this pig, we're going to make some Italian sausage. The area that the pig was living in has a lot of wild fennel, so the pairing there seemed like a natural where did the food come from thing. The flavor of wild pork also just, I think, pairs very well with a fennel, and partially spicy Italian sausage is one of my personal favorites. But this is sausage making is one of those areas that you can really sort of go in any creative direction you want, especially with wild pig. It's super versatile meat and tastes pretty great in most applications. With most wild game, you are not that blessed. So pork has a lot higher percentage of fat. Even wild pork tends to have more fat than, say, deer or elk. Bear is the next fattiest, although I've heard mixed things depending on what the bear was eating at the time. So if you're eating a bear that was shot in the fall and that bear was eating a lot of, say, dead fish in a river, probably not going to be so good. If it was a spring bear and it was eating blueberries and tubers, probably pretty good. So with this, you can really go as detailed or as not detailed as you want. The amount of work you put in here, I think, affects the quality of the sausage, but if you're in a rush or you don't have a lot of time to work on this, then you can cut into chunks and not do a whole lot of trimming, and it's still going to turn out pretty good. That, however, is based on the quality of your grinder. If you don't have a good grinder, dedicated meat grinder, and you're going to be shooting some wild game, I highly recommend you buy one. I've used a KitchenAid meat grinder attachment for many years. It's a fine tool for the job, but it's not as fast or efficient or easy to clean as a dedicated grinder is. So I made the switch. I highly recommend you do the same. Although it is a fair amount of additional space that's going to take up in your kitchen, so balance that against your priorities at home. If you've got a big kitchen and tons of space, go wild. If you've got a tiny little apartment and not a ton of counter space, you got to weigh that against everything else. Maybe you could take that pork shoulder and braise it instead of making sausage, right? There's a lot of different options that you can do based on what your interests are and what game you actually end up shooting. We're going to be grinding about 8 pounds of pork shoulder today, and for demonstration purposes, I'll show you the amount of trim that I'm taking off is really not that much compared to the amount of meat that we're getting out of it. With various game meats and various ages of animals, that will change significantly. So with the elk that I shot last year, for instance, it's got a lot more sinew, it's got a lot more connective tissue because it was a considerably older animal and a larger one. So there's a lot more connective tissue that needs to connect things, I guess. With a younger wild pig, it's relatively light on that stuff, so it's pretty quick, pretty easy. And here we go. There's a lot of different ways that you can go about the actual cutting into chunks. I've got sort of a routine that I developed, but it doesn't really, it's not a hard science. It's more of just a get a feel for what chunks your grinder can accept and how you want to most efficiently go from one big hunk of pork to a lot of different tiny hunks of pork. You get a little bit of a zen-like state when you're trimming meat or grinding meat. I've gotten to enjoy it. It's pretty fun. So the other thing to consider when you're cutting up some wild game is that your fat tolerance is going to be different based on the meat. So pork fat, for instance, is delicious at any temperature. Venison fat, say deer, elk, has a bit of a mixed reputation. There's a compound in the fat of deer and elk that it's called stearic acid, and it makes the fat seem waxy So think of another food that has stearic acid in it is chocolate. When you eat chocolate, it sort of coats the inside of your mouth, and it's got that really warm, luscious, rich taste to it. When your stearic acid is involved in venison fat, that's not such a fun texture. It's sort of waxy. It's just not great. The way that you can remedy that is by serving it ripping hot. So if there's some fat on the outside of a venison roast and you get it super crispy right before service and you put the plates out immediately after, it'll be all right. If you, say, are serving some elk bone marrow, as I tried to do a few times, you have to make sure that it's coming out of the oven, going straight onto a plate, getting right in front of a person, and they're immediately scooping it out into some toast and eating it within 60 seconds. It's sort of a high wire act, which I do not recommend. I also tend to cut a little smaller than the grinder requires. I don't know why. I think force of habit from years of using a KitchenAid grinder. Doesn't really matter as long as it's not too big. You're okay. Yeah, it doesn't look great. Let's cut some of that off too. Yeah, you can sort of tell how tough that is based on the resistance I'm getting on the knife. If it's that tough to cut through, that means your teeth are not going to have a fun time chewing it either. This is also where I like an inflexible blade. It gives you, at least to my taste, it gives you a little more flexibility to use to pull meat apart. It makes it a little easier to follow the seams, which is the goal for trying to remove as much of this sort of connective tissue stuff as possible. Flexible boning knives are great, but as the name might suggest, they're really better for following the contours of a bone, as opposed to this sort of a little more, not delicate, but free form sort of knife work. It's nice to have the stability and consistency of a fixed, non-flexible blade here. The nice thing about grinding it when it's still a little bit frozen, it's a little easier to play with, and it means that you don't have to be as vigilant about taking the cubed up meat and immediately putting in the freezer. You can, if it's sitting there in the bowl, the fact that it's still semi-frozen is going to keep it at a safe temperature. Just a little more hair. I use the back of the knife blade for this. You don't need to. You generally want to avoid scraping with the sharp edge of your knife. That'll dull it up pretty quickly. But nobody cares about the back edge, so for taking hairs out of fat or little specks of dirt like that. Dirt or what? I don't know. It's pretty good for that though. Knife skills, also very important. If you've never done it, I recommend taking a knife skills class. If you have a culinary school or some sort of community cooking place, they'll oftentimes have those classes. There's probably stuff that I've already forgotten from those classes, so don't judge me too hard, but they're really useful for setting you up with good habits for not cutting your finger off. Of course, now as soon as I say that, I'm going to cut my finger off. So generally, when you're cutting a vegetable or something of that nature, you want to keep the knife against the back of your finger here on these knuckles. Keep your fingertips tucked in so you don't cut them off. It's a little more difficult to do when you're sort of trying to cut off little edges of meat like this, so you just sort of avoid cutting in the direction of your fingers or the rest of your body is a pretty good rule. Doesn't always work, but pretty good rule. And work slow, work deliberately. Try not to go too fast because that's where you slip up. One thing you also definitely want to do after you finish trimming is weigh your meat. You will end up, obviously, with less than you started with. And with sausage making, it's very important that you get the ratios right. The absolute amounts is not as important, but you need to have that ratio of meat to salt to sometimes sugar to spices be correct. With a lot of other wild game cooking, you can sort of wing it, oh, I'm going to add a little bit more black pepper than this recipe calls for because I like more black pepper. That's fine. With sausage, especially with cured sausage, but even with fresh sausage, I think you want to stick to the recipe. Those ratios are there for a reason, especially if you're doing anything with curing salt. Definitely want to stick to that ratio. That's how people get sick. So the nice thing about sausage making is you can sort of do little mini batches and test out different flavor combinations or curing times, that sort of stuff. Like mini science experiments with pork. After you're done cutting up the meat, you want to get it onto a sheet pan and get it in the freezer. For the best freezing distribution, you want there to be a single layer of meat, so you can get it sort of laid out on the sheet pan and just make sure it's even so that you get sort of even freezing across the whole sheet. And obviously the stuff in the middle, maybe it's not obvious, the stuff in the middle will not freeze as quickly, so you want to have a little bit looser distribution in the middle and a little bit denser distribution towards the edges because this part will freeze faster and this part will freeze slower. Once you get it all on a sheet pan, just pop it in the freezer for probably minimum of 1 hour. If you're working with a KitchenAid, stick to an hour, maybe 2. And into the freezer we go after I wash my hands. Cool, so we're making sausage. We have this enormous grinder that was lent to us by our friend Manny.
Thanks, Manny.
Because mine can't find the blade for it and can't buy a blade in person anywhere. So we're waiting for that to arrive by Amazon, but in the meantime, wanted to get this sausage made. So we're gonna load some meat into the hopper here. The meat needs to be semi-frozen, ideally. You want it to be very, very cold and semi-solid. And then you want to mix in some of the hard fat, which is going to be completely frozen, to make sure it doesn't smear at all.
Obviously, you've weighed out your portions of both of these beforehand. It's very important that you have an even mix.
And that the ratio is correct. Mm-hmm. Or at least what you're shooting for.
You can do any batch size you want as long as the ratios are on.
Cool. So we got our hopper loaded up here with some meat and some fat. We're going to go ahead and turn on the... Why don't you do that since my hands are all meaty?
Okay.
Towards you.
Towards me. Here we go.
Cool. So go ahead and pry it on in.
Full in the bowl here.
Oh, just waiting to turn it off.
Yep. Okay. And gonna give that a chance to fall off, or just knock it off. There we go.
Knock it off.
Knock it off. Okay.
Knock it off.
I'm gonna turn this back on just so I don't have to listen to you.
Yeah, that's a fair move. For this batch, we've got 9 pounds of pork shoulder and 3 pounds of pork back fat. Wild back fat is apparently not great for sausage. It has a softer texture, and so it doesn't hold up in the same ways that you would expect from a pork sausage. So we're using wild pork for the shoulder and commercial pork for the back fat. But in the end, we'll have delicious sausage, so it seems like it's worth the compromise. All right.
I'd say so.
Let's do this last little bit.
Let's do it.
James is using the plunger tool here for safety, although...
You could conceivably use your hands, but I like these.
Yeah. That's how we make our money. Sweet. So wait for that last little bit to go through, and then we're good to go. Now that you got the meat and fat all ground up together, you want to mix in your seasonings. If your seasonings aren't pre-measured out at this point, what you want to do is make sure that the meat grind stays super cold. So back in the fridge at the bare minimum, and ideally in a bowl of ice as well. But since our seasonings are ready to go, we can just skip right to the mixing.
You want to talk about what kind of seasoning we have here, Eric?
Yeah, it's a fennel, sort of a fennel-heavy pork sausage, just classic Italian, semi-spicy, not too crazy. Wanted it to be accessible, but still have some zip. So a lot of fennel, some chili flakes, cayenne pepper, coriander, paprika. There's a whole bunch of stuff in there.
So do you want to gradually mix it in, or do you want to just kind of dump it and work it in there?
I don't think it really matters. You're just looking for an even distribution. So
Okay.
and the important thing is I forgot to measure out the liquids. So that we do need to get those liquids and get those going. Drip, drip, drip.
50. 100. Exactly 144.
Dope. And then we need, so that was like 2 and change. So we need another 400 milliliters of water.
Okay.
So on top of that, just
Can I pour this
cold out of the
in?
sink. Sure.
Okay. Lost in the sauce.
That's Flavor Town.
How many milliliters of water?
400.
400.
So the grind looks good. We don't have a lot of smearing, which is what you're looking for. You can see there's nice even breaks between the fat and the meat section. And you can see that's the case in most of these pieces as well, which means our fat and meat were both sufficiently cold. The pieces of fat and the pieces of meat. I'm just going to hit it with the good stuff. I mean, it's just water, so it's not really. Now, we're going to mix in our seasonings, our dry seasonings. So James has already added the liquids. Now we're going to add in the dry and then combine and get our hands really cold.
You ready?
Yeah, hit it. Yeah, give me like a third. Yeah, that's good.
That's
and
a good
then,
start.
Yeah, and we'll
Cool.
get it turned over. And this is definitely one of those situations where it's nice to have at least 2 people because your hands will get very cold.
It's also nice to have a bigger bowl.
Yeah. Yeah, this is about as much sausage as I would want to make in this bowl. If you were a professional, you'd probably be doing this in an enormous stand mixer, but I don't own an enormous stand mixer, so we're going to do it like you can imagine Italian peasants doing it many, many years ago. All right, give me the rest of that seasoning.
Okay.
Or at least another third.
The oldest written mention of sausage from European history, anyway, is actually the Odyssey, and it mentions blood sausage specifically. This is not a blood sausage, but yeah, food for thought.
Literally. Yeah, wild game blood sausage is sort of an elusive thing because the standard place where you're going to shoot an animal, if you're an ethical hunter, I think, is right in the heart and lung area, which means the chance of retrieving good, clean blood from that animal is very low. The other option you could do is take a neck or head shot, but unless you're very close or an extremely accurate shot, I don't think those are very ethical shots. So
When you miss on a head or neck shot, you have a tremendous chance to wound the animal, and it's pretty ugly. They, as opposed to a almost instant death, they're running around the forest, busted up, and they're gonna die at some point, but it's not gonna be soon.
all right, move the rest of that.
Huh? Oh, you need the rest of it now? Okay, you got it. There we go. Whew, just scrape that. All right. Yes, you're good.
Whew, man, that's cold. Gets me every time. If you were using a stand mixer, this is when you'd be looking for it to get sort of sticky. So we're looking to do the same thing, but with our fingers, which are now very cold. So I'm going to tag out here momentarily with Mr. James.
Is that the fat rendering slowly when it gets sticky, or is that just moisture being worked out?
I think it's there's like a protein in the meat that binds with the liquid. It's like myosin or something. I'll have to look it up.
Myoglobin. Myoglobin?
That's it.
So this is also typically why sausage would be frequently made in the winter, in places where sausage was used to preserve food. Because if you were trying to do this outside in the summer, pretty much anywhere in the world, it would not go well for you. We good?
Again?
What do you think?
I'd probably go a little.
Okay.
I don't know if you can really overmix at this point, and since we want to really make sure that we get a decent bind and make sure that all the seasonings are, what the fuck? A rogue stem of some sort. Is it fennel, maybe?
It was oregano.
So you can see at this point, all of the liquid that we added is integrated. There's not any hiding out in the bottom of the bowl. It's all absorbed spices and distributed itself through the meat, which is what you want.
Think we're good?
Yeah, I think that's good to go.
It's looking nice, huh?
Looking nice.
So before we actually finish stuffing, we should probably make sure this is going to taste good. So we're going to start with a test patty and fry it up real quick and see how it tastes.
So when you're forming this, you want to make sure it's relatively thin. Sausage takes a surprisingly long time to cook, and you're not looking for any like caramelization here. You're really just looking for get it cooked to a safe temperature and see how it tastes. With most sausage you're making, there's going to be enough fat in here that you don't really need to add any fat to the pan. So just pop it in a pan on sort of low to medium and give it a few minutes to cook, flip it, give it another few minutes, and taste.
So we're going to give it a little flip here. Oh yeah, that's looking tasty. All right. So he wasn't going for any caramelization, but that's a happy little accident right there. Okay, let's pull this off now. Excellent plating, obviously.
Totes. Right in the middle of the circle, James.
I did it.
Killer job. Yep. Cooked fine, as you can see. Yeah, that was great.
Yep.
Cool. Yeah, let's case it. So this is a 5-pound cylinder sausage stuffer. So as you can see, it's already starting to cool down from the meat that we've added to it. When you're adding meat to a cylindrical sausage stuffer, you want to make sure that you are pressing out any air pockets as you go. So you add, a nice healthy handful of meat and sort of press it down with your fingers to make sure it is relatively flush with the meat below it.
If you don't get those air pockets out, you're going to blow your sausage up when you're cooking and get oil everywhere, and you're going to burn yourself, and it's going to be bad for everybody.
All right, so this guy is now relatively full, and we're gonna start actually stuffing some sausage. So we've got the sausage stuffer all set up, and we're going to get our sausage casings ready to go. The important thing here is not to attach the sausage casings to the stuffer immediately. You actually want to stuff some of the meat out through this tube so that there's no big air pocket created inside the casings. So go ahead and
Crank it.
Oh, slow.
Yep.
Yep, keep on going. And yeah, that's good. These casings come with a handy dandy threader mechanism. So this blue thing is helpful for making sure you get the casings all the way onto your sausage stuffer tube. These are natural hog casings. I prefer them primarily because they're very durable. So a lot of synthetic sausage casings and even some other animal sausage casings are very easy to break. And when you're making sausage, it's the most annoying thing that could possibly happen to you.
Natural pork casings like this are also going to give you a great snap to your sausage that you really don't get from these synthetic sausages.
Oh, snap.
Oh, snap indeed.
If you feel the need to make a phallic joke at this point,
Oh, this is prime dick joke territory right here.
follow your heart. Cool. So you do want to leave a little bit at the end here, but we are, like I said, we're going to try and squeeze out as much of the air bubble situation as possible. Don't worry if there are some, because you're going to go through and poke them out later, but for now we're just going to tie a simple knot there and we're off to the races. So I like to have a sheet pan underneath. Makes it easier to keep the coil going, so let's go, James. Yeah. So it's helpful to have two people here, but not 100% necessary. Done it by myself, it's just a bit more of a pain in the ass. You have to attend to both sides of the equation a little more. What you're looking for here is full, but not like crazy tight, because you want to be able to twist this into links after the fact. Stop. Let's go.
Do you have to be concerned about keeping it cold as you're doing this?
You wouldn't want it to get warm, but at this point, most of the temperature concerns are just about keeping it food safe. So
I see.
you want it to be cold, but not, it doesn't have to be freezing.
Yeah, no, it's refrigerated.
Yeah.
Are there any considerations you want to take into account as you get to the bottom of this? No.
At this point, I'm gonna go ahead and tie this off and cut this so that we don't have a ridiculously unwieldy situation.
A ridiculously unwieldy sausage?
Sure. Cool, so now we've got our sausage. This is just half of the batch that we are making today, but we'll go ahead and show you linking. So basically, you can choose to make as small or as large of a link as you'd like. You just sort of pick the point you want. I'm going for sort of a traditional, we're gonna put this in a bun and have sort of a cookout with it. So yeah, in the 5 to 6 inch ballpark. Just give it a twist and then make sure you remember which direction you twisted in, because you're gonna go the opposite direction on the next sausage. Inevitably, you will forget. It's great.
Why do you go the opposite way?
Because if you go the same way, then you do this, and you end up with a previous one
I see.
Twisted. So I fulfilled my own
You already
prophecy
messed up?
in about 4 seconds.
Yep.
You can certainly make sort of shorter ones if you wanted to go down in the, not really finger foods arena, but like I said, to me, 5 to 6 inches is about right. And, it is the average. That's what most doctors say. And this is why I mentioned that you want to leave yourself some slack, so that basically you'll see how this is a little looser over here. So I'm going to sort of squeeze that meat towards the link to sort of tighten it up. And making it a little looser when you start is an easy way to make sure that you have the flexibility to get the diameter that you're looking for. And then you can see that we have actually a fair number of air bubbles in here, but what we'll do here momentarily is actually pop those air bubbles, and they will not be a problem anymore. Cool, so there we are. So after you get your sausages linked, there's 2 steps that you need to go through. You need to prick out all these air holes so that they don't stay in the sausage. Then you're going to let it rest on this rack overnight in the fridge. That'll let the casings seal back up and tighten around the meat so that you get a nice, firm, intact, non-explodey sausage.
Those are all technical terms.
Totes. If you got a little pin, that's probably better, but I can't find my little pin, so you're just gonna try to make as tiny a little incision as you can in each of the holes. If it's a little bigger, it's not that end of the world. So if when you poke the hole, you can see the casing sort of tighten up around that previous air hole, that's what you're looking for. So once you've got most of your air bubbles out, you're pretty much ready to go. So we're gonna pop this in the fridge, leave it overnight, and they'll be ready to cook. So let's do that. Thanks for watching, and bon voyage.
Follow us at SourceWild on all your social media platforms.
Wherever good tweets are found.
Bad tweets too, don't worry.